I was reorganizing David's laptop for his quarterly tax submissions when I accidentally clicked the wrong folder and found 623 photos from his medical conference in Oregon. Every single one featured my sister Carmen in designer dresses, holding his hand on coastal cliffs I'd never seen, kissing him under waterfalls I'd never visited, wearing the platinum necklace I thought he'd bought for my birthday. The cursor had been hovering over what I thought was the 2024 expense reports folder when I double-clicked, and suddenly my laptop screen exploded with images that made my stomach drop to the floor. Photo after photo of my husband David and my younger sister Carmen. Not just together, but together in ways that sisters and brothers-in-law should never be. There was Carmen, her dark hair catching the Oregon sunset, leaning against David's chest on a pristine rocky beach. David's hands wrapped possessively around her waist as they posed in front of the iconic Haystack Rock at Cannon Beach. Another photo showed them sharing a wine flight with two glasses, their faces close enough that their foreheads touched. But it was the timestamp that made my hands start shaking, March 18th through March 25th, 2024. The exact same week David had told me he was attending a critical medical device conference in Portland. I scrolled through image after image, each one more devastating than the last. Carmen wearing a flowing emerald sundress I'd never seen before, David's arm draped casually over her shoulders as they watched the sunset from what looked like a luxury resort balcony. A selfie of them in matching Northwestern University hoodies, both grinning at the camera with the kind of unbridled joy I hadn't seen on David's face in months. Photos of them hiking together through Columbia River Gorge, dining at romantic oceanfront restaurants together, exploring Powell's books with their fingers intertwined like teenage sweethearts. My breathing became shallow as I tried to process what I was seeing. These weren't accidental encounters or coincidental meetings. The photos showed an established couple comfortable in their intimacy, familiar with each other's bodies and mannerisms. David's hand naturally finding the small of Carmen's back, Carmen's fingers intertwined with his as they walked along Cannon Beach. The way they looked at each other in photo after photo, with genuine affection, desire, and what could only be described as love. But the image that shattered what remained of my composure was buried halfway through the folder, a close-up shot of Carmen's neck adorned with the delicate platinum chain David had given me for my 29th birthday just 3 months earlier. The same necklace he'd claimed cost him every penny of his consulting bonus and represented his commitment to our future together. The same necklace I'd worn proudly to every medical conference since believing it symbolized his love and dedication. Except now I was staring at it wrapped around my sister's throat as she fed David a piece of local Oregon cheese on a cliff top 300 miles away from our home in Seattle during a trip I'd helped him budget for believing every word about vendor meetings and medical presentations. My name is Elena Rodriguez, and at 29, I'd already established myself as one of the most dedicated cardiac intensive care nurses at Seattle Medical Center. Colleagues often joked that I cared more about my patients' heart rhythms than my own heartbeat, working consecutive 12-hour shifts without complaint, volunteering for the most complex cases, and staying late to comfort families during their darkest moments. Growing up as the eldest daughter in a Mexican-American family in South Seattle, I'd learned early that hard work and dedication were the pathways to everything worthwhile in life. My parents, both factory workers who'd immigrated from Guadalajara in the 1980s, had instilled in me values of integrity, loyalty, and putting others' needs before your own. These weren't just ideals, they were the operating principles that guided every decision I made. When other kids were partying in college, I was studying for my nursing boards. When my friends were traveling Europe after graduation, I was working double shifts to pay off student loans and save for a future I believed would be built on solid ground. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd chosen a profession dedicated to healing others' hearts while remaining blind to the wounds being inflicted in my own life. In the hospital, I could spot the smallest changes in a patient's cardiac rhythm, detect subtle shifts that other staff missed, advocate fiercely for patients who couldn't speak for themselves. But somehow I'd failed to notice the most obvious signs of deterioration in my own marriage. I'd always been the responsible one, the reliable daughter, the friend everyone called during emergencies. In high school, while my younger sister Carmen was sneaking out to art gallery openings and dating the captain of the debate team, I was volunteering at local senior centers and maintaining a 4.0 GPA, preparing for a future in healthcare. The contrast between us had been apparent from childhood. Carmen was the spontaneous, charismatic one who could charm her way out of any situation, while I was methodical, thoughtful, and perhaps too trusting for my own good. Our family dynamics had established patterns that would follow us into adulthood. Carmen was the one who took risks, made dramatic decisions, and somehow always landed on her feet when things went wrong. I was the one who cleaned up messes, provided stability, and sacrificed my own wants for the greater good of family harmony. Our parents adored us both, but in different ways. They worried about Carmen's impulsiveness while taking my reliability for granted. "Elena," my mother would say in Spanish, "you can't save everyone. Sometimes you need to save some energy for yourself." I dismiss her concerns with a smile, believing that love meant sacrifice, that relationships required one person to be the steady foundation while the other pursued their dreams. This philosophy had attracted me to David in the first place. When we met at a medical technology expo in Portland 4 years earlier, he was working as a consultant for cardiac device manufacturers, charming and ambitious, but struggling to find his footing in the competitive medical technology industry. He'd approached me during a break between sessions, complimenting my thoughtful question about patient monitoring protocols, and I'd been immediately drawn to his confidence and apparent passion for healthcare innovation. David seemed to need someone stable, someone who believed in his potential when he doubted himself. During our early relationship, I'd supported him through 2 career transitions, helped him study for industry certifications, and covered our expenses during his lean months. When he struggled with self-doubt, I was his cheerleader. When he faced rejection from medical device companies, I was his comfort. When he needed someone to believe in his dreams of becoming a top medical consultant, I was his unwavering supporter. The pattern had continued into our marriage. I worked overtime to maintain our lifestyle while David built his consulting practice. I handled all the household responsibilities while he traveled for client meetings. I managed our finances, planned our social calendar, and maintained relationships with both our families while he focused on networking and professional development. I told myself this was temporary, that once David established himself, we'd have the partnership I'd always imagined. My work at the hospital had become my sanctuary, the place where my nurturing instincts were appreciated and effective. I specialized in caring for patients with complex cardiac conditions, families facing impossible decisions, situations that required the kind of emotional strength and dedication I naturally possessed. Parents would specifically request me for their family members' care, knowing I'd advocate fiercely for the best outcomes. My supervisor had recently recommended me for a promotion to head of cardiac ICU recognition, that my 6 years of exceptional service hadn't gone unnoticed. The cardiac intensive care unit was where I felt most myself, competent, valued, and making a genuine difference in the world. I could walk into a room full of worried families and somehow bring calm and hope. My colleagues respected my clinical judgment, families trusted my care, and patients responded to my gentle but confident presence. In those hospital corridors, I knew exactly who I was and what I was worth. But even my professional success couldn't fill the growing emptiness in my personal life. David and I had been trying to start a family for 18 months, and each month brought fresh disappointment. I'd undergone extensive fertility testing, modified my diet, tracked ovulation with scientific precision, and maintained optimism despite mounting evidence that conceiving naturally would be challenging. David had been supportive but distant, participating in the medical appointments, but seeming increasingly detached from the process. The fertility struggles had become another arena where I took responsibility for our shared disappointment. I researched treatments, scheduled appointments, managed medications, and bore the emotional weight of each failed cycle. David would offer comfort when the pregnancy tests came back negative, but I could sense his frustration and wondered if he blamed me for our inability to conceive. Looking back now, I realized that my dedication to everyone else's well-being had blinded me to my own needs. I'd become so skilled at reading cardiac monitors and patient symptoms that I'd lost the ability to assess my own life objectively. The same intuition that made me an exceptional nurse had somehow failed to protect me from the people closest to me. The metadata on each photo told a story that contradicted everything David had shared about his week in Oregon. While he'd texted me about boring conference rooms and exhausting networking dinners, the photos revealed romantic coastal drives, couples spa treatments, and intimate picnics on secluded beaches. While he'd complained about the terrible hotel continental breakfast, these images showed elaborate room service spreads on a private balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean. My mind raced as I tried to reconcile the evidence with the reality I thought I'd been living. David had called me every evening during that trip, sharing details about medical technology presentations and difficult clients. He'd sent me photos of conference rooms and complained about the poor Wi-Fi in his hotel. Every detail had been carefully crafted to maintain the illusion of a legitimate business trip while he was actually living a romantic fantasy with my sister. I discovered videos mixed among the photos that made the betrayal even more visceral. A clip of Carmen laughing as David attempted to skip stones at the beach, calling him baby in a voice dripping with affection. Another video showed them dancing barefoot on the sand to music I couldn't hear, moving together with the familiarity of lovers, not in-laws who barely spoke at family gatherings. They moved like people who'd been intimate many times before, who knew each other's bodies, who had private jokes and shared memories that excluded me entirely. The final image in the folder was a screenshot of an Oregon resort booking confirmation, a 7-night stay at the Salishan Coastal Lodge in a romantic ocean view suite for 2 guests. Mr. David Chen and Miss Carmen Rodriguez, my maiden name. My sister had used my maiden name to book a romantic getaway with my husband. I sat back in our home office chair, the same chair where David had sat just 4 months earlier, showing me his conference itinerary on this very laptop, explaining how important this Oregon trip was for his career advancement. The same desk where I'd helped him organize his presentation materials, iron his business shirts, and pack his suitcase with the professional attire he'd apparently never worn. 4 years of marriage, 6 years together total, and this is how I discovered that the 2 people I trusted most in the world had been living a completely different life behind my back. Not just an affair, but an elaborate deception that had transformed David's business trip into their romantic honeymoon, funded partially by my own salary as a cardiac nurse, working 12-hour shifts to support our household while David built his consulting career. The photos weren't just evidence of betrayal. They were documentation of a parallel universe where my husband and sister had created the kind of romantic paradise I'd been dreaming David and I might visit for our upcoming 5th anniversary. Every sunset, every adventure, every intimate moment I'd imagined sharing with the man I'd married, they'd already lived together while I worked extra shifts to afford the mortgage payments. David said his consulting income couldn't quite cover. As I continued scrolling, I found photos that revealed this wasn't their first trip together. Timestamps from earlier months showed them in different locations: Mount Hood, the Oregon coast, even what appeared to be a weekend in Vancouver. Each set of photos documented not just physical intimacy, but emotional connection inside jokes, and the kind of easy comfort that comes from spending significant time together. But this was just the beginning of a story that would reveal how naive I'd been, how long this had been planned, and how the woman who discovered these photos would be very different from the woman who walked away from that laptop screen. Because sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most powerful transformations. And sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is exactly what you need to discover who you really are. The photos were only the first piece of a puzzle that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The changes had begun so gradually that I'd almost convinced myself I was imagining them. It started in January 2024, when David's travel schedule suddenly intensified beyond what seemed normal, even for someone building a medical consulting practice. What had been 2 or 3 trips per month became weekly departures, with David explaining that several major medical device companies were launching new cardiac technologies that required extensive relationship building with key hospitals. "The competition is fierce," he'd tell me while packing his suitcase for yet another trip. "If I don't establish these connections, now we'll lose contracts to the bigger consulting firms. This is temporary, Elena, but it's critical for our future." His explanations made sense, and I supported him completely, taking pride in his dedication and work ethic. But I started noticing inconsistencies that felt insignificant at the time. David would mention flying to Sacramento for a conference, then accidentally reference a restaurant that I knew was in Portland. When I'd ask about it, he'd laugh and say he'd mixed up his trips. The travel was making him disoriented. I'd smile and joke about his busy schedule, never questioning the explanation. More concerning were the small changes in his preparation rituals. Previously, David had been meticulous about his professional appearance, spending time selecting appropriate business attire, and ensuring he had all necessary presentation materials. Now I'd find casual clothes, flannel shirts, hiking boots, expensive outdoor gear mixed in with his business suits. When I'd comment on the unusual packing choices, David would explain that many medical companies were embracing casual networking concepts for their conferences, trying to create more relaxed environments for relationship building. "You know how the tech industry has influenced healthcare," he'd say. "Everyone's trying to be more approachable, more authentic." His communication patterns during these trips shifted in ways that seemed minor, but left me feeling slightly disconnected. Previously, David would call me every evening from his hotel room, sharing details about his meetings, the doctors he'd spoken with, and the challenges he was facing in his consulting work. Now his calls became shorter and less frequent, often coming at odd times with background noise that didn't sound like hotel rooms. "Sorry, honey, I'm exhausted," he'd say when I'd try to engage him in longer conversations. "These West Coast clients are demanding, and I'm spending 14 hours a day in meetings. Can we talk tomorrow when I'm back home?" I'd reassure him that I understood, encouraging him to get the rest he needed for his important work. The most troubling change was in David's energy level and demeanor when he returned from these supposedly grueling business trips. Instead of appearing drained from intensive conference schedules and difficult client negotiations, he seemed refreshed and energized, almost glowing with the kind of vitality that suggested relaxation rather than professional stress. His skin would be noticeably tan, which he'd attribute to outdoor networking events or hotel fitness facilities with UV therapy equipment. "You know how these medical companies try to impress consultants," he'd say, unpacking clothes that smelled like ocean air rather than hotel laundry detergent. "They had this whole wellness component built into the conference. I probably should have mentioned it, but I didn't want you to think I was having fun while you were working so hard at the hospital." More troubling was how David began excluding me from work events that had previously included spouses. For 3 years, I'd attended his company's annual consulting summit, quarterly client dinners, and holiday celebrations, building relationships with his colleagues and their partners. Suddenly, David would return from these events with apologies and explanations that felt increasingly rehearsed. "They changed the format this year," he'd explain after missing the spring consulting summit. "It's more intensive, focused on training rather than socializing. They specifically asked that spouses stay home so we can concentrate on the new cardiac device launches." When I expressed disappointment about missing the event I'd been looking forward to, David would kiss my forehead and promise that next year would be different. The financial irregularities began appearing around the same time, though they were subtle enough that I initially dismissed them as administrative errors. Our joint credit card statements would show charges from upscale restaurants in cities where David claimed to be attending boring medical conferences, often for amounts that seemed excessive for solo business dinners. When I'd ask about these expenses, David would explain that medical companies encouraged relationship building through expensive client entertainment. "Dr. Martinez's device coordinator loves sushi," he'd say, showing me a receipt for a $180 dinner at a high-end Japanese restaurant. I took her and her assistant to dinner to discuss our new monitoring protocols. These relationship investments pay off in the long run when they choose our consulting services over competitors. Most subtle but persistent was the change in David's attention to our shared goals and future plans. Our conversations about starting a family became increasingly brief and perfunctory. His engagement with our fertility treatments felt mechanical rather than emotionally invested. The man who had once researched treatment options alongside me now seemed distracted during medical appointments, checking his phone and appearing eager for the sessions to end. I had no idea I was already being systematically excluded from his real life. By February 2024, the inconsistencies in David's stories became harder to ignore, though I was still finding ways to rationalize each discrepancy. The first major red flag came when he returned from what he described as a grueling 3-day medical device conference in Sacramento, looking remarkably tan and relaxed. When I commented on his healthy glow, David quickly explained that the conference hotel had an exceptional fitness center with UV therapy lights. "You know how these medical companies try to impress consultants?" he said, unpacking clothes that smelled like coastal air rather than hotel air conditioning. They had this whole wellness component built into the conference. "I probably should have mentioned it, but I didn't want you to think I was having fun while you were working so hard at the hospital." The explanation felt forced, but what really troubled me was finding sand in his shoes. Actual beach sand, not the kind you'd encounter at a hotel fitness center. When I mentioned it casually, David seemed flustered before explaining that the wellness center had included a sand volleyball court for team-building exercises. The detail felt too specific, too rehearsed, like he'd prepared for exactly this question. More concerning were the financial irregularities I began noticing in our joint checking account. David had always handled his business expenses through company credit cards, but suddenly there were personal charges for amounts that seemed excessive for work travel. A $350 charge at an outdoor gear shop in Oregon appeared the same week he'd claimed to be in meetings in Sacramento. When I asked about it, David seemed genuinely surprised to see the charge before quickly recovering with an explanation about buying gifts for his top clients. "It's relationship building," he said, showing me a receipt for what appeared to be women's outdoor accessories designer hiking boots, premium rain gear, and a silk scarf. Dr. Patterson's office manager loves unique gifts, and I found these handmade items that I thought would help secure our account. You know how competitive this industry is. Sometimes you have to go above and beyond. The explanation felt increasingly hollow, especially when similar charges began appearing regularly. Expensive dinners for two at romantic restaurants in cities where David claimed to be attending solo conferences. Charges at luxury spas during supposed intensive training seminars. A $450 charge at a high-end jewelry boutique in Portland that David dismissively explained as a gift card for his territory coordinator's birthday. What unsettled me most was discovering that David had been in frequent contact with my sister Carmen, something that seemed completely out of character for both of them. They'd never been particularly polite at family gatherings, but rarely speaking otherwise. When I noticed Carmen's name appearing frequently in David's text messages, often late at night or early in the morning, I asked about their sudden friendship. "Oh, she's been asking me about travel recommendations," David said casually, but something in his tone felt rehearsed. "You know how Carmen is always planning her next adventure. She wanted advice about Pacific Northwest destinations, since I'm traveling there so much for work. I've been sharing some of the great places I've discovered during my business trips." The explanation made sense on the surface. Carmen had always been spontaneous about travel, and David had indeed been visiting many beautiful locations for work. But when I tried to engage Carmen in conversation about her travel plans during our weekly family dinner, she seemed evasive and changed the subject quickly, her usual bubbly enthusiasm replaced by nervous fidgeting. "Just exploring options," she said with a dismissive wave, avoiding eye contact. "You know me, I never stick to one plan for long." But I caught her exchanging a meaningful look with David across the dinner table, a moment of silent communication that made my stomach clench with unease. The most devastating discovery came when I found a receipt in David's pants pocket for a jewelry store in Portland, the same weekend he'd claimed to be attending a medical symposium in Sacramento. The receipt was for a platinum necklace, the exact same one he'd given me for my birthday 2 months later. When he presented it to me in March, claiming it had cost him his entire quarterly consulting bonus, I'd been moved to tears by his thoughtfulness and sacrifice. Now staring at a receipt dated weeks earlier from a completely different city than where he'd claimed to be, I felt my first real moment of panic. The timeline didn't work, the location didn't match, and the story about sacrificing his bonus to buy me something special had been a complete fabrication. Worse yet, the receipt showed he'd purchased a matching set necklace, earrings, and bracelet for a total cost that was nearly double our monthly mortgage payment. I began paying closer attention to Carmen during family gatherings, and my worst fears were confirmed when I noticed her wearing diamond earrings that perfectly matched my birthday necklace. The same cut, the same setting, unmistakably part of the set David had purchased in Portland. When I complimented them, Carmen's face flushed as she mumbled something about saving up for something special before quickly changing the subject. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. David's mysterious travel expenses, his secretive communication with Carmen, the matching jewelry, the inconsistent stories about his whereabouts, everything pointed to a betrayal so intimate and systematic that my mind struggled to process its implications. But even as the warning signs accumulated, I found myself making excuses desperate to preserve the foundation of trust that our marriage was built on. I wasn't ready to confront the possibility that the two people I loved most in the world were conspiring against me. The decision to actively investigate rather than passively accept felt both terrifying and empowering. For months, I'd been drowning in uncertainty, second-guessing my own perceptions, and making excuses for increasingly obvious red flags. Taking control of the situation by seeking concrete evidence felt like the first proactive choice I'd made in my own life for far too long. I'd spent my entire career as a nurse learning to recognize patterns, to investigate symptoms, and to advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. When a patient came into the cardiac ICU with symptoms that didn't quite add up, I didn't accept the easy explanations. I dug deeper, asked more questions, and gathered more evidence until I understood what was really happening. The same analytical skills that made me excellent at diagnosing cardiac conditions could be applied to diagnosing what was happening in my own life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could spot the smallest changes in a patient's heart rhythm, detect subtle shifts that other staff missed, advocate fiercely for people who couldn't speak for themselves yet. I'd been blind to the deterioration of my own marriage. I started with our shared laptop, the one David had been using less frequently as he relied more on his work devices. My hands trembled as I opened his browser history, email accounts, and photo folders. I wasn't looking to violate his privacy. Maliciously, I was looking to confirm or dispel the fears that were consuming my mental health and destroying my ability to function in my marriage. The first thing I noticed was how meticulously David had been covering his tracks. His browser history was suspiciously clean, with only work-related searches and innocent websites. But I remembered from my computer training at the hospital that deleted browser history could often be recovered. I downloaded a data recovery program and began the process of retrieving what David thought he'd erased forever. As the program ran, I methodically searched through his email accounts, finding mostly work correspondence and spam. But buried in his drafts folder, I discovered partially written messages that had never been sent, fragments of conversations that referenced places he'd never mentioned visiting, and people I didn't recognize. What I found in that first hour of searching would change everything. But more importantly, the act of choosing to seek truth, instead of accepting convenient lies, marked the moment I began reclaiming my own power. After months of feeling like a victim of circumstances beyond my control, I was finally taking action to understand and address what was really happening in my life. The investigation began not with anger or revenge, but with a nurse's methodical approach to diagnosing a patient whose symptoms weren't adding up. I was finally ready to discover what was making my marriage so sick, even if the treatment required radical surgery. What I discovered in David's digital footprint during those first few hours of investigation was like finding pieces of a puzzle that revealed a completely different picture than the one I'd been living with. The browser history alone told a story that contradicted months of supposed business trips and medical conferences. Instead of searches for medical device, industry news, or client information, I found extensive research on romantic resort destinations, couples activities, and travel booking sites. The data recovery program I'd installed revealed searches that David thought he'd permanently deleted: best romantic restaurants, Oregon coast; couples spa packages, Portland; private beach resorts, Pacific Northwest; and most damning, how to hide travel expenses from spouse. Each search felt like a physical blow, confirming that my suspicions weren't paranoia, but accurate diagnosis of a diseased marriage. The most damning evidence came from his saved bookmarks folder, carelessly labeled work research, but containing links to luxury vacation rentals in Oregon, couples spa packages in Hood River, and romantic restaurants in Portland, all destinations that coincided with his supposed business trips. When I cross-referenced these bookmarks with his travel dates, the pattern became undeniable. David hadn't been attending medical conferences. He'd been planning romantic getaways. But the discovery that stopped my heart was a saved email confirmation buried in his drafts folder, a booking for 2 people at a luxury coastal resort in Cannon Beach for the exact dates of his upcoming Sacramento business meeting. The reservation was under his name, with a second guest listed as C. Rodriguez, my sister's name, and my maiden name. They weren't just having an affair, they were using my own family name to book their romantic escapes. I screenshot every piece of evidence with methodical precision, my nursing training taking over, as I documented symptoms of a disease that was destroying my marriage. Credit card statements showed charges at jewelry stores in cities where David claimed to be attending boring medical conferences. Restaurant receipts revealed expensive dinners for 2 at romantic establishments during trips when he'd told me he was eating alone in hotel rooms after long conference days. The financial evidence was staggering in its scope. David had been using our joint credit cards to fund an entirely separate lifestyle, but he'd been clever about it, spacing out the charges, mixing them with legitimate expenses, and using cash advances to avoid itemized receipts. I found charges for lingerie at expensive boutiques, couples massage packages, champagne and strawberry room service orders, and even what appeared to be jewelry purchases that I'd never received. The most devastating discovery came when I found a hidden folder of photos on our shared cloud storage account, images David had apparently forgotten to delete or thought I'd never find. Pictures of my sister Carmen wearing lingerie I'd never seen before, posing in hotel rooms with ocean views that David had described to me as cramped conference accommodations. Photos of them holding hands on beaches, sharing intimate dinners, and looking at each other with the kind of passion I thought David and I had lost due to work stress and fertility struggles. One image showed Carmen wearing what I initially thought was a new diamond bracelet, until I realized it was the matching piece to the necklace David had given me for my birthday. He'd bought a jewelry set and split it between his wife and his mistress, as if we were both accessories in his double life. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, using the same romantic gesture to manipulate both women in his life. As I continued investigating, I found text message threads that David had thought he'd deleted, conversations between him and Carmen, planning their trips with an intimacy that spoke of a long-term relationship, not a recent affair. References to our place in Oregon and discussions about when we can finally be together permanently revealed that this wasn't just infidelity, it was a complete, alternate life they'd been building together. The messages included detailed logistics about avoiding detection, coordinating their stories, timing their communications when I was at work, even discussing my schedule and emotional state to determine the safest times for their interactions. They'd been studying me like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was finding a detailed expense spreadsheet hidden in David's personal files, tracking every dollar he'd spent on their relationship versus money spent on our marriage. The comparison was devastating. He'd spent more on a single weekend trip with Carmen than he'd spent on our last 3 anniversaries combined. The digital evidence painted a picture of systematic deception that had been going on for nearly 18 months. Every business trip, every late-night phone call, every excuse about client demands had been carefully constructed, lies designed to give David the freedom to build a relationship with my sister, while maintaining the financial stability and domestic support that my marriage provided. But perhaps the most shocking discovery was realizing how long this had been planned and how many people in my life had apparently known the truth, while I remained completely oblivious to my own husband's betrayal. The evidence suggested a conspiracy that extended far beyond just David and Carmen, involving colleagues, friends, and possibly even family members who had been helping to maintain their deception. The deeper I dug into David's digital life, the more I realized that what I'd discovered wasn't just an affair. It was an elaborate, long-term conspiracy that involved multiple people in my life working together to deceive me. Text messages between David and Carmen revealed planning that went back over 14 months, starting just after our third wedding anniversary, when I'd been working extra shifts to help pay for the fertility treatments we'd both claimed to want. The most devastating messages were ones where they discussed me directly, referring to me as the obstacle and the problem we need to solve permanently. Carmen had written, "She's so trusting, it almost makes me feel guilty." Almost. David's response was even more chilling. "Don't feel guilty. She's getting what she wants, someone to pay the bills and take care of everything domestic. We're just taking what we deserve." Reading through months of their communications revealed the calculated cruelty of their planning. They had discussed timing their trips to coincide with my most demanding work periods, knowing I'd be too exhausted to ask probing questions. They'd researched my shift schedules at the hospital, coordinating their meetups during my longest work days, when I'd return home depleted and grateful for any attention David showed me. The betrayal extended beyond just David and Carmen. I found evidence that my own parents had been inadvertently helping to cover for their relationship. Text messages showed Carmen asking my mother for my work schedule, claiming she wanted to plan surprise visits, but actually using the information to ensure she and David could meet without risk of running into me. My father had unknowingly provided alibis by confirming family events that David was supposedly attending while he was actually with Carmen. Even more disturbing was discovering a detailed spreadsheet David had created tracking my emotional state, work schedule, and financial contributions to our household. He'd been monitoring my overtime hours, calculating how much extra money my additional shifts brought in, and timing his fake business trips to maximize both my earnings and my exhaustion. The document included notes about my fertility treatment schedule, with reminders to be extra supportive during my most vulnerable moments. The most shocking discovery was a group text thread that included several of David's medical industry colleagues, people I'd considered friends who'd attended our wedding and shared dinners at our home. They'd been covering for David's fake business trips, providing him with conference schedules and industry information he could reference to make his lies more convincing. One colleague had even created fake meeting invitations and conference materials to support David's deception. "Thanks for covering for me with the Portland conference details," David had written to a coworker named Marcus. "Elena bought the whole story. You guys are lifesavers." Marcus replied, "Just remember us when you're living your best life in Oregon permanently. Some of us are stuck in actual medical consulting hell." Another colleague, Jennifer, had added, "At least someone's getting a happy ending out of this industry. Don't forget the little people when you're sipping wines on the coast." The phrase, "living your best life in Oregon permanently," made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about having an affair. They were planning to relocate together, apparently using money they'd been systematically extracting from our joint accounts. I found evidence of an Oregon bank account that David had opened using our address, but listing himself as single with deposits that matched withdrawals from our savings account that he'd explained as business investments. The financial deception was breathtakingly sophisticated. David had been creating fake invoices for non-existent business expenses, complete with professional logos and detailed line items. He'd established relationships with several travel booking sites using different email addresses to create false paper trails for his supposed conferences. The Oregon resort bookings were made through a complex system of gift cards and prepaid credit cards to avoid direct charges to our joint accounts. Even more devastating was discovering that the fertility struggles that had been causing me so much emotional pain were being used as part of their long-term strategy. Text messages revealed that David had been sabotaging our attempts to conceive, secretly disposing of fertility medications and skipping doses of supplements our doctor had prescribed for him. The longer she thinks it's just bad luck, the more time we have to plan our exit strategy," he'd written to Carmen. But perhaps the most cruel discovery was a series of voice messages between David and Carmen recorded during my fertility treatment appointments. They'd been laughing about my dedication to the process, mocking my hope and determination. In one particularly devastating recording, David mimicked my voice, asking the doctor about treatment options while Carmen giggled in the background. "She's so desperate to have my baby," David said. "She has no idea I'd rather have anyone else's at this point." They'd calculated that my dedication to trying to save our marriage, combined with my demanding work schedule and the emotional toll of failed fertility treatments, would keep me distracted and compliant while they built their new life together. Every extra shift I'd worked to pay for treatments was actually funding their romantic getaways. Every month I'd blamed myself for our failure to conceive was a month they'd bought themselves to plan my replacement. The scope of their deception was breathtaking in its cruelty and sophistication. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a methodically planned dismantling of my life, conducted by people I'd trusted completely while they discussed my eventual destruction with casual indifference. They'd turned my love, my work ethic, and my dreams of motherhood into weapons against me, all while presenting themselves as my greatest supporters. After 3 sleepless nights of processing the devastating evidence I'd uncovered, something remarkable happened inside me. The grief and shock that had initially paralyzed me transformed into something much more powerful: cold, calculated determination. I realized that David and Carmen had made a critical error in their planning. They'd underestimated the woman they were betraying. They saw me as a compliant, trusting victim who would continue funding their deception indefinitely. They had no idea they were dealing with someone who'd spent years making life-or-death decisions in cardiac intensive care. My nursing background had taught me that when facing a crisis, emotion could be deadly. The same methodical thinking that helped me save patients' lives would now be applied to saving my own future. Instead of confronting them immediately in anger, which would only alert them to start covering their tracks more carefully, I decided to let them continue believing I was oblivious while I systematically dismantled their plans. The first phase of my strategy involved securing irrefutable evidence. I began creating detailed spreadsheets documenting every lie David had told, every fake conference he'd claimed to attend, and every dollar he'd stolen from our joint accounts. I cross-referenced his travel dates with actual medical industry conferences, proving that most of his supposed business trips were completely fabricated. I printed screenshots of their text conversations, financial records, and even researched the hotels where they'd stayed, discovering that many bookings were made under romantic packages rather than business rates. Next, I quietly secured my financial assets. Over several weeks, I gradually transferred money from our joint accounts into a personal savings account they didn't know existed, timing the withdrawals to coincide with my regular paycheck deposits so they'd appear as normal spending. I documented every fraudulent charge David had made, every withdrawal for their secret trips, and every lie he'd told about business expenses. My methodical record-keeping would become crucial evidence later, but more importantly, it protected my financial future from their continued theft. I also began gathering testimonial evidence by having casual conversations with David's medical colleagues at industry events, asking innocent questions about conference schedules and company policies. What I learned confirmed my suspicions. Most of the conferences David claimed to attend either didn't exist or had completely different dates and locations than what he'd told me. His colleagues, thinking they were protecting him, actually provided me with the evidence I needed to prove his systematic deception. The psychological aspect of maintaining my facade required incredible strength. I had to smile when David returned from his business trips, listen to his fabricated stories about client meetings, and respond to his expressions of love with apparent warmth, all while knowing he was actively planning my eventual abandonment. I studied his behavior patterns, noting when he seemed most confident versus when he appeared nervous, learning to read the signs of his deception. Most importantly, I consulted with a divorce attorney without David's knowledge, learning about Washington state's laws regarding adultery, financial fraud, and asset protection. My lawyer, Sarah Chen, explained that the evidence I'd gathered could not only prove grounds for divorce, but also support claims for financial compensation due to David's systematic theft of marital assets to fund his affair. We discussed timing strategy and the importance of catching them in the act rather than simply confronting them with historical evidence. I also began building my professional network, strengthening relationships with colleagues who could provide character references and emotional support when the truth inevitably came out. I documented my work performance, secured recommendations from supervisors, and even researched opportunities for career advancement that could help me establish financial independence more quickly. The hardest part of my strategic planning was maintaining the facade of normalcy while living with someone I now knew was actively working to destroy my life. I had to suppress my anger when he complained about work stress, knowing he was actually stressed about coordinating his double life. I had to respond supportively when he mentioned being tired from travel, knowing he was exhausted from romantic getaways rather than business meetings. But perhaps the most crucial element of my planning was psychological preparation. I practiced conversations in my head, anticipating their denials, excuses, and attempts at manipulation. I researched the psychological tactics that cheaters typically use when confronted blame-shifting, gaslighting, minimizing, and prepared responses that would keep me in control of the narrative. I also prepared for the emotional aftermath, arranging for time off work and identifying friends who could provide support during what I knew would be a difficult period. I researched temporary housing options in case I needed to leave our home, and I secured copies of all important documents in a safety deposit box they couldn't access. By the time I finished my strategic planning, I wasn't just documenting their betrayal, I was systematically engineering their downfall. Every move was calculated, every piece of evidence was secured, and every potential consequence was anticipated. David had taught me that the people closest to you could be your most dangerous enemies. Now I was about to teach him that underestimating those same people could be the most expensive mistake of his life. The prey was about to become the predator, and neither David nor Carmen had any idea what was coming. The perfect opportunity to expose David and Carmen's betrayal presented itself in early May, when David announced another critical medical consulting trip to Oregon. The same trip I'd already discovered was actually a romantic getaway they'd been planning for months. This time, however, I would be ready for them. Instead of remaining the naive, trusting wife they expected, I would orchestrate the most devastating confrontation they could imagine. My plan required precision timing and careful manipulation of their own arrogance against them. I knew from their text messages that they'd grown overconfident, believing I was completely oblivious to their relationship. This confidence would become their downfall. I booked my own flight to Portland, arriving a day before David's supposed departure, and reserved a room at the same luxury resort where they planned to stay. Every detail had to be perfect for the trap I was setting. The genius of my plan was using their own deception to destroy them. I created a fake family emergency that would require me to unexpectedly travel to Oregon the same week as David's conference. I told him my grandmother had been in a serious car accident in Portland and was in critical condition, a story that played perfectly into his perception of me as someone who would drop everything to help family members. "Oh my God, Elena, you have to go," David said when I shared the fabricated crisis, his concern appearing genuine, while I knew he was internally celebrating that I'd be out of the way during his romantic trip. "Don't worry about the cost. This is an emergency. Your family needs you." His immediate encouragement to spend money on the unexpected trip was particularly galling, considering he'd been stealing from our joint accounts to fund his affair. But his eagerness to support my emergency travel confirmed that he had no idea I knew about his real plans. I watched his relief as he helped me pack, even suggesting I extend my stay if my grandmother needed additional support. The next phase involved carefully coordinating with my workplace to ensure I could take the time off without raising suspicions. I told my supervisor about the family emergency, providing just enough detail to secure emergency leave while maintaining the fiction that kept David unaware of my real intentions. My nursing colleagues were incredibly supportive, offering to cover my shifts and providing the emotional support they thought I needed for a genuine family crisis. Meanwhile, I continued monitoring David and Carmen's communications, watching them finalize their plans for what they believed would be another uninterrupted romantic getaway. Their text messages revealed excitement about finally having a whole week together without any interruptions and discussions about taking things to the next level during their Oregon trip. They even joked about how easy it had been to manipulate me into clearing the way for their romance. I spent hours researching the resort where they'd be staying, studying the layout, identifying the best observation points, and planning my approach. I reserved a rental car and mapped out multiple routes between the airport and resort. I even researched Oregon law regarding recording conversations, ensuring that any evidence I gathered would be legally admissible. The most damaging evidence came when I discovered they were planning to use this trip to make permanent decisions about their future together. Text messages revealed they intended to look at real estate, potentially purchasing property in Oregon, where they could relocate permanently after divorcing me and liquidating our shared assets. They'd already contacted a realtor and scheduled viewings at oceanfront condominiums that cost more than David's annual consulting income. I also discovered that this Oregon trip was intended to be their engagement vacation. David had purchased an engagement ring using money stolen from our joint savings account and planned to propose to Carmen on the beach, where they'd first kissed during a previous trip. The ring was hidden in our bedroom closet in a box labeled conference materials, a box I found while searching for additional evidence. On the morning of my departure for Oregon, I played my role perfectly, the devoted wife reluctantly leaving her husband to attend to a family emergency, grateful for his understanding and support. David drove me to the airport, kissed me goodbye, and wished me luck with my grandmother's recovery. As I walked toward security, I could see the relief in his face, believing he'd successfully manipulated me into clearing the way for his romantic week with my sister. "Call me when you land," he said, squeezing my hand with what appeared to be genuine affection. "And don't worry about anything here. I'll be stuck in boring meetings all week anyway." I nodded, playing the part of the trusting wife one last time. "I love you." I said the words feeling like ash in my mouth, but necessary for maintaining my cover. He had no idea that the woman boarding that plane was no longer the trusting, naive wife he'd been deceiving for months. The woman heading to Oregon was someone very different, someone with evidence, a planned legal backup, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Someone who was about to turn their romantic paradise into the scene of their complete destruction. The trap was set, and they were walking directly into it. I arrived at the Oregon resort a full day before David and Carmen were scheduled to check in, giving me time to prepare for what would be the most important performance of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was staying at the same luxury resort where they'd planned their romantic escape, funded partially by my own nursing salary. The ocean view room I'd booked overlooked the same beach where they'd taken dozens of intimate photos during their previous trips. The morning of their arrival, I positioned myself in the resort's lobby cafe with a clear view of the front desk, wearing sunglasses and a hat to avoid immediate recognition. Watching them check in together was surreal. They moved with the comfortable familiarity of an established couple. David's hand casually resting on Carmen's lower back as they laughed at something the desk clerk said. The sight of my husband and sister behaving like honeymooners should have devastated me, but instead, I felt only cold satisfaction knowing their charade was about to end. What struck me most was how natural they looked together, how effortlessly they played the role of vacationing lovers. David carried both their bags with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times before, while Carmen linked her arm through his as they walked toward the elevators. They weren't nervous or secretive. They were completely comfortable, which told me this routine was well established. I followed them at a distance as they settled into their oceanfront suite, noting the room number and timing their movements. They spent the afternoon on the beach completely relaxed and unsuspecting, taking the same types of romantic photos I'd discovered on David's laptop. I watched from my balcony as David applied sunscreen to Carmen's back as she fed him pieces of local Oregon berries as they kissed in the shallow waves like teenagers on spring break. During their beachside lunch, I used high-powered binoculars to observe their body language and interactions. They weren't just physically intimate, they communicated with the shorthand of people who'd spent extensive time together. Carmen would start a sentence and David would finish it. They shared inside jokes that made them both laugh. Most telling was how David looked at her with genuine affection and attention that he hadn't shown me in months. That evening, I executed the confrontation I'd been planning for weeks. I waited until they returned to their room after what appeared to be a romantic dinner at the resort's most expensive restaurant, then knocked on their door at exactly 9:30 p.m. I'd timed it perfectly late enough that they'd be relaxed and off guard, but early enough that they wouldn't be asleep. When David answered expecting room service or hotel staff, his face went through a progression of emotions I'll never forget. Confusion, recognition, shock, and finally pure terror. For a moment he seemed frozen, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as his brain struggled to process what was happening. "Surprise," I said calmly, pushing past him into the room where Carmen was emerging from the bathroom, wearing the matching diamond earrings to my birthday necklace and a silk robe I'd never seen before. "I thought I joined you for your medical conference." The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen's face went completely white, her hand instinctively moving to cover the earrings as if that could somehow make them disappear. David started stammering explanations that made no sense, his medical consulting training failing him completely in this moment of crisis. "Elena, the conference got canceled and Carmen was already here for vacation." His voice trailed off as he realized how ridiculous he sounded. "Stop," I said, pulling out my phone and showing them the screenshots of their text messages I'd compiled into a devastating slideshow. "I know about everything. The fake business trips, the Oregon bank account, the fertility sabotage, the jewelry, the real estate plans, the colleague conspiracies. I know about all of it." As I scrolled through the evidence, their expressions shifted from denial to resignation to panic. The text messages where they called me the obstacle, the photos of their previous trips, the financial records showing David's systematic theft from our joint accounts, the voice recordings of them mocking my fertility struggles, all of it displayed on my phone screen like a prosecutor's closing argument. "I've been documenting everything for months." I continued, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. "My lawyer has copies of all of this. The divorce papers are already filed, the joint accounts are frozen, and both of your employers will be receiving copies of these conversations tomorrow morning, along with evidence of fraud and professional misconduct." David tried to speak, but I wasn't finished. "You see, while you two were playing house with my money and laughing about my naivety, I was doing what I do best, methodically diagnosing a problem and implementing a treatment plan. You thought you were so clever planning my destruction. Well, I funded your romance, but you made one critical mistake. You underestimated exactly who you were betraying." The room fell silent except for the sound of waves crashing outside their romantic oceanfront suite, the same waves that had provided the soundtrack to their secret affair, now witnessing the end of their elaborate deception. What followed my revelation was perhaps more satisfying than the confrontation itself. Watching two people who had orchestrated such an elaborate deception completely fall apart when faced with the consequences of their actions. David immediately tried to shift into damage control mode, his medical consulting training kicking in as he attempted to negotiate his way out of an impossible situation. "Elena, please, we can work this out," he said, his voice taking on the desperate tone I'd heard him use with difficult clients. "This doesn't have to destroy everything we've built together. We can go to counseling, we can fix this. I made a mistake, but I still love you." The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a man who had been systematically stealing from our joint accounts, sabotaging our fertility treatments, and planning to abandon me after liquidating our shared assets, now suggesting we could simply fix our marriage through therapy. His sales persona was crumbling as he realized that his usual charm and persuasion tactics were powerless against documented evidence. Carmen's reaction was even more revealing. Instead of showing remorse or attempting to apologize, she became defensive and angry, as if I was the one who had wronged her by discovering their betrayal. "You have no right to spy on us." She snapped, her face flushed with indignation. "What David and I have is real love, not some convenient arrangement like your marriage. You're just upset because someone finally chose happiness over your controlling behavior." "Real love," I repeated calmly, pulling up the text messages where they discussed using me as their personal ATM while planning my emotional destruction. "Is that what you call systematically stealing money from someone who trusted you both completely? Is that what you call sabotaging fertility treatments while laughing about my desperation to have children?" The immediate practical consequences began unfolding rapidly. David's phone started buzzing with notifications as the automated systems I'd set up began executing the legal and financial protections my attorney had prepared. His access to our joint credit cards was revoked, his name was removed from our mortgage account, and his employer received an email detailing his use of fake business conferences to conduct an extramarital affair. "You can't do this," David said, frantically checking his phone as notification after notification confirmed that his comfortable life was disappearing in real time. "Those accounts are in both our names. You can't just freeze everything without warning." "Actually, I can," I replied, showing him the legal documentation my lawyer had prepared. "Washington state law is very clear about protecting assets when one spouse is committing fraud. Every dollar you stole for your romantic getaways is documented and will be recovered with interest. Your colleagues who helped create fake conference materials will be facing their own professional consequences." As David's phone continued buzzing, I could see the reality of his situation sinking in. His medical consulting company's HR department had received a detailed report about his fraudulent expense claims and misuse of company resources. His territory manager was being copied on emails showing how he'd lied about conference attendance. The professional network he'd spent years building was about to learn exactly what kind of person he really was. Carmen tried a different approach, appealing to our supposed sisterly bond, while tears began streaming down her face. "Elena, please, you don't understand how complicated this situation is," she said, her voice breaking. "David and I never meant for this to happen. We tried to fight our feelings, but sometimes love just takes over. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive us? We're still family." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice cutting through her manipulative explanation. "Don't you dare try to romanticize what you've done. You didn't fall in love despite yourselves. You planned this systematically for over a year while I worked extra shifts to pay for fertility treatments that my own husband was sabotaging. You used our parents as unwitting accomplices. You mocked my pain during the most vulnerable moments of my life, and you celebrated each success in your deception." The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in. Their romantic Oregon getaway had become the scene of their complete exposure. The resort suite they'd booked for a week of celebration had become a crime scene where their elaborate deception was finally unraveling. Other guests could probably hear the commotion through the thin walls, adding public humiliation to their private catastrophe. David made one final, desperate attempt at negotiation. "What do you want?" "Money. The house." "Just tell me what it will take to keep this private. Think about your reputation, your career. Do you really want everyone to know about this?" I smiled for the first time since entering their room, an expression of genuine satisfaction rather than happiness. "I want justice, and thanks to your own arrogance and my documentation, I'm going to get it. As for my reputation, I'm not the one who's been living a lie for the past year. I'm the one who discovered the truth and had the courage to act on it. The woman who had funded their betrayal with her nursing salary, who had supported David's fake career advancement, who had blamed herself for fertility struggles that were being deliberately caused, that woman was gone. In her place stood someone who had transformed pain into power, betrayal into strategic thinking, and love into the strength to demand better. The months following my confrontation in Oregon brought a whirlwind of legal proceedings, financial recovery, and personal transformation that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. The meticulous documentation I'd gathered proved invaluable in court, where David's systematic fraud and financial deception resulted in a divorce settlement that not only restored everything he'd stolen, but awarded me significant additional compensation for his breach of fiduciary duty as a spouse. David's professional life collapsed almost immediately. His medical consulting company, horrified to discover that one of their senior consultants had been using fake conferences to conduct an affair, terminated his employment within 48 hours of receiving my evidence. The medical industry is smaller than most people realize, and word of his deception spread quickly among competitors, effectively blacklisting him from medical consulting permanently. The man who had once bragged about his career prospects was now struggling to find employment in any field that required trust or integrity. The Oregon bank account he'd opened using stolen funds was frozen, and its contents recovered along with penalties that left David in significant debt. The jewelry he'd purchased for both Carmen and me became evidence in the financial fraud case, ultimately awarded to me as part of the restitution. Wearing those diamond earrings to family gatherings, the ones Carmen had flaunted during their affair, became a small but satisfying reminder of justice served. My relationship with my family required more complex navigation. My parents were devastated to learn about Carmen's role in the betrayal, particularly when they realized how she'd manipulated them into providing alibis and information. The trust between my sister and the rest of our family may never fully recover. Carmen's attempts to maintain that she and David were true love fell flat when their relationship imploded under the pressure of real-world consequences. Apparently, their connection wasn't strong enough to survive unemployment, debt, and social ostracism. Professionally, my career flourished in ways I hadn't expected. The confidence and analytical skills I developed while investigating David's betrayal translated into exceptional leadership abilities at the hospital. I was promoted to head of cardiac ICU within 6 months of my divorce, with a salary increase that more than compensated for the loss of David's income. My colleagues, initially concerned about my personal crisis, came to admire my resilience and strategic thinking. Most surprisingly, addressing my fertility concerns became possible once I removed the stress and sabotage from my life. 8 months after my divorce was finalized, I underwent successful fertility treatments using a sperm donor, something I'd never considered while married, but which now felt like reclaiming my autonomy over my reproductive future. My daughter Isabella was born healthy and perfect 13 months after that confrontation in Oregon. The house David and I had shared became entirely mine through the divorce settlement, but I ultimately chose to sell it and purchase a smaller home closer to the hospital. The fresh start felt essential, and the proceeds from the sale funded my maternity leave and Isabella's college savings account. Today, 4 years later, I wake up every morning in a life I built entirely on my own terms. The woman who discovered those devastating photos seems like a stranger now, someone who accepted crumbs when she deserved the whole meal, someone who worked herself to exhaustion, supporting people who were planning her destruction. I learned that sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the most necessary transformations. And sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted is exactly what you need to discover what you actually deserve. Looking back on this experience 4 years later, I realized that discovering those photos was the moment my real life began. For years, I'd been living according to someone else's script, the devoted wife, the understanding partner, the woman who sacrificed her own needs to support everyone else's dreams. The betrayal forced me to confront a fundamental truth. I had been so focused on being worthy of love that I'd forgotten to demand the love I actually deserved. The most important lesson I learned was about the difference between loyalty and enabling. I'd convinced myself that supporting David through his career struggles, covering his financial shortfalls, and accepting his increasingly distant behavior was what good wives do. In reality, I was enabling a man who saw my dedication as weakness rather than strength, my trust as naivety rather than love. True partnership requires mutual respect and shared sacrifice, not one person funding another's deception. I also learned to trust my instincts again. For months I had felt that something was wrong in my marriage, but I'd dismissed those feelings as paranoia or insecurity. My nursing training had taught me to recognize symptoms and investigate inconsistencies, yet I'd ignored those same skills when it came to diagnosing my own relationship. Now I understand that the voice telling you something isn't right is usually correct, and ignoring it only delays the inevitable while allowing more damage to be done. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that strength isn't about enduring betrayal, it's about having the courage to walk away when someone shows you who they really are. The old Elena would have tried to save her marriage even after discovering the affair, believing that love meant fighting for relationships no matter how toxic they became. The woman I am today knows that sometimes loving yourself means refusing to accept treatment that falls below your standards. My advice to anyone facing a similar situation is this document: everything, trust your instincts, and remember that you deserve better than scraps of affection from people who should be giving you their whole hearts. Don't make excuses for behavior that requires excuses. Don't rationalize away red flags because you're afraid of being alone. And most importantly, don't allow anyone to convince you that your standards are too high. Raise them higher. The woman who discovered those organ photos was so focused on saving everyone else that she was slowly disappearing. The woman I am today understands that you can't save people who don't want to be saved, and you can't love people into treating you well. What you can do is build a life so fulfilling that anyone who wants to be part of it has to add value, not subtract it. Isabella is growing up watching a mother who chose herself over settling, who built a career in life on her own terms, who turned betrayal into transformation. She'll never see me accepting less than I deserve because she needs to learn early that her worth isn't negotiable. The photos that shattered my world ultimately saved my life. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing. It just takes time to see the difference. Today, I'm grateful for every moment of that devastating discovery because it led me to a life I never knew I wanted with a strength I never knew I had. The betrayal ended my marriage, but it began my real life, and that life is more beautiful than any lie I was living before.